August 1944. Imagine the night roads of northern France, still smelling of burnt gunpowder and diesel, illuminated not by artillery flashes but by an endless column of headlights. Thousands of trucks, roaring forward without pause, their engines coughing out a low mechanical symphony that the German soldiers in nearby forests could hear for miles. The sound was alien, relentless, like a factory conveyor belt transplanted into the French countryside. To the Wehrmacht, who had calculated every mile of supply as a delicate equation of horse-drawn wagons and rationed fuel, this noise was terrifying proof of a new kind of war. Let us zoom out. At Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia, General Alfred Jodl and his staff studied maps and charts, tracing the American advance under Patton's Third Army. They believed they saw the inevitable. The U.S. had outrun its supply lines. No army in history, they reasoned, could keep moving at such speed without collapsing under its own weight. After all, the Germans themselves had invented blitzkrieg and knew its fatal flaw, logistics. Armored divisions consumed fuel like fire devours oxygen, and Patton's divisions were now more than 400 miles from their supply ports in Normandy. The German generals chuckled, convinced that soon the American juggernaut would grind to a halt. Now zoom in, into the cab of one of those American trucks, a GMC CCKW deuce and a half. The steering wheel vibrates under the grip of a young African-American driver, his eyes bloodshot after 20 hours behind the wheel. A hand-painted slogan on the hood reads, "Patton's Blood Bank." He is 19 years old, far from home, denied equal rights in his own country, but in this moment he is the lifeline of Patton's army. In the rear, crates of artillery shells rattle with every bump. Outside, the night is alive with the smell of gasoline, the rumble of engines, and the strange sight of headlights blazing openly across liberated France. The convoy does not stop. It cannot stop. This was the Red Ball Express, an audacious logistics operation that turned highways into one-way arteries of war. Nearly 6,000 trucks, driven 75% by African-American soldiers, moving 12,500 tons of supplies every day, through mud, rain, exhaustion, and enemy fire. It was loud, wasteful, dangerous, and unstoppable. Within 72 hours of its launch, Patton's tanks were refueled and rearmed, smashing through German defenses at the Seine. Within weeks, Paris was liberated. Within months, the Germans were retreating toward their own border. The German generals who laughed at American logistics would soon realize their mistake. They were fighting not just tanks and soldiers, but the full force of American industry on wheels. This is the story of how convoys, not cannons, won the race across France. If you want to understand how trucks defeated tanks, how young drivers with little sleep and less recognition rewrote the laws of modern warfare, stay with us. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and join us as we follow the Red Ball Express, the operation that turned gasoline, grit, and sheer numbers into victory. To understand why the Red Ball Express shocked the German general staff, we need to step back into the summer of 1944. The Allies had broken out of Normandy in Operation Cobra, and Patton's Third Army was unleashed like a predator across the open plains of France. His armored columns advanced faster than any military planners thought possible, in some cases 60 miles in a single day. But this breathtaking pace concealed a lethal vulnerability: fuel. Every Sherman tank was a thirsty beast. On the road, it drank half a mile per gallon. Off-road, even worse. A single armored division required over 1,000 tons of supplies each day, while an infantry division needed 700. Multiply this by 12 divisions under Patton's command, and you had an appetite of 12,000 tons daily. The Germans, veterans of long campaigns in Russia, recognized this immediately. They had seen their own panzers stranded on the steppe, engines silent for lack of gasoline. They believed the Americans would soon suffer the same fate. At Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia, General Alfred Jodl and others did the math. Patton's army was 400 miles from Normandy's beaches, the only deep-water ports capable of supplying it. Roads were cratered, bridges destroyed, railways sabotaged. Even if the Americans possessed unlimited trucks, which the Germans doubted, the sheer distance would choke them. Physical laws cannot be violated, one German officer remarked. Not even by American industry. To the Wehrmacht, The conclusion was inescapable. Patton's spearheads were about to run dry. But the Americans were preparing something the Germans had never imagined. At a requisitioned chateau in Le Mans on August 25, 1944, a group of logistics officers led by Lieutenant Colonel Laurent Ayres laid out a radical plan. If traditional supply methods were collapsing, they would invent new ones. The idea was simple but audacious: turn the highways of France into a one-way conveyor belt of war. Trucks would run 20 hours a day, headlights blazing even at night. One road would be reserved for loaded convoys driving east, another for empty trucks returning west. Convoys would depart every 5 minutes, with military police removing any vehicle slower than 25 miles per hour. Mobile repair units would be stationed every 50 miles, ready to cannibalize broken trucks for parts. There would be no camouflage, no blackout discipline, no caution, just raw volume. This system was christened the Red Ball Express, borrowing the railway term for freight trains given absolute priority. It was an operation that broke every German assumption. They believed logistics must be orderly, concealed, and conservative. The Americans bet on something else entirely: overwhelming speed, mechanical redundancy, and sheer industrial weight. Within 36 hours of planning, the first convoys were rolling. Drivers of the 3,916th Quartermaster Truck Company climbed into their GMC CCKW 2.5-ton trucks, the Deuce and a Half. These vehicles, simple but rugged, were mass-produced by the hundreds of thousands. Each carried 5 tons of supplies, often overloaded to 7. Soon, nearly 6,000 trucks were on the road, operated by 23,000 drivers. Here, a striking irony emerges. Roughly 75% of those drivers were African-American soldiers, serving in a segregated army that denied them equal rights. At home, they could not eat in the same restaurants as white Americans. In France, they could not serve in combat roles. But here, behind the wheel of the Red Ball Express, they became the indispensable lifeline of Patton's advance. They painted slogans on their trucks: Detroit to Berlin Express, Hitler, here we come. They invented their own road rules, pushing broken vehicles into ditches, treating any truck below 20 miles per hour as a roadblock. They endured exhaustion, accidents, even enemy strafing, but they kept driving. By the end of its first week, the Red Ball Express had delivered nearly 90,000 tons of supplies. That meant fuel, ammunition, rations, spare parts, everything an army needed not just to fight but to move. German reconnaissance units, observing from ridgelines, could hardly believe their eyes. Endless columns of trucks, headlights visible for 20 kilometers at night, rolling openly in defiance of every principle of military concealment. One officer reported, "The enemy operates a supply system beyond our comprehension. It is not military science. It is mass production applied to warfare." And this was exactly the point. American logistics, like American industry, thrived on scale. Where Germans saw waste, Americans saw redundancy. If 30% of trucks broke down daily, replacements were waiting. If 500 engines failed in a week, spare parts arrived on the next ship. If drivers collapsed from exhaustion, replacements were trained in 2 days. The Red Ball Express embodied a philosophy the Germans could not match: logistics as an industrial torrent rather than a fragile chain. The consequences were immediate. Patton's Third Army did not halt. Fueled by the Red Ball Express, it surged across France, crossing the Seine, liberating Paris, and driving to the German border within weeks. German generals who had predicted paralysis now faced disaster. Their own supply system still relied 80% on horses, while American trucks ran day and night. Their armies rationed ammunition to a few rounds per gun, while American artillery fired 100,000 shells in a single day. Their fuel reserves dwindled, while American convoys carried more gasoline in one day than the Wehrmacht allotted to entire panzer divisions in a month. The Red Ball Express was more than a supply line. It was psychological warfare. German troops at the front could hear the endless rumble of trucks at night, carrying what seemed like infinite supplies. French civilians saw American drivers tossing them chocolate, cigarettes, and soap, luxuries denied under German occupation. Even German prisoners, forced to load American convoys, admitted their worldview collapsed when they realized the Americans could waste more than the Reich could produce. Thus, the Red Ball Express revealed the true balance of power in the European war. Tanks and planes won battles, but trucks won campaigns. The Germans had built blitzkrieg around speed, but they never solved its fundamental weakness, logistics. The Americans did, not with elegance or efficiency, but with volume, improvisation, and the willpower of 23,000 exhausted truck drivers. And so, when German generals laughed at American logistics in August 1944, they were laughing at their own ignorance. Within weeks, their laughter would be silenced by the roar of engines and the sight of Patton's tanks fueled by an unstoppable highway of steel and rubber. The thesis of the Red Ball Express is simple yet revolutionary. In modern warfare, logistics is not merely support, it is strategy. German generals had measured victory in tank designs and tactical maneuvers. The Americans measured it in gallons of fuel delivered per day, trucks on the road per hour, and tons of supplies moved per mile. The Red Ball Express proved that wars are not won solely by the sharpness of the sword, but by the strength of the supply chain that feeds it. To see why, let's begin with numbers, because war is ultimately arithmetic. An armored division in 1944 consumed around 150,000 gallons of fuel daily. That's the equivalent of a modern small city's entire fuel consumption. Add to that thousands of tons of food, artillery shells, spare parts, medical supplies, and even luxuries like cigarettes and chocolate to maintain morale. Patton commanded 12 divisions advancing at unprecedented speed, which meant a daily appetite of over 12,000 tons. Now compare that with what the Germans believed possible. On the Eastern Front, their supply system had collapsed under far smaller requirements. In Russia, trucks broke down in mud, horses died in snow, and fuel reserves vanished into the vast distances. German doctrine held that supply could never keep pace with armored thrusts beyond 200 miles. When they saw Patton advancing 400 miles from the Normandy ports, they assumed the same fate awaited the Americans. But the United States had one critical advantage: trucks. The GMC CCKW 2.5-ton truck, nicknamed the Deuce and a Half, was the backbone of the Red Ball Express. By 1944, more than 500,000 had been produced. These vehicles were designed not for brilliance but for reliability. They had all-wheel drive as standard, waterproof engines that could ford streams, and rugged frames that could carry more than their rated load. German engineers marveled, grudgingly, at the fact that a single American factory could turn out more trucks in a month than Germany produced in a year. The system itself was equally audacious. 2 parallel routes, one eastbound for loaded trucks, one westbound for empties. Convoys departed every 5 minutes, headlights blazing even at night. Military police enforced speed minimums, pulling over any truck that slowed below 25 miles per hour. Maintenance teams leapfrogged along the route, operating roadside triage, 15 minutes to fix a problem, or the truck was pushed aside and cannibalized. This meant the flow never stopped. By abandoning traditional military caution, the Americans achieved what German doctrine considered impossible. The first week alone delivered nearly 90,000 tons of supplies, an average of over 12,800 tons daily. German observers simply refused to believe the reports, dismissing them as propaganda. Yet reconnaissance photos showed convoys stretching for 20 kilometers, and captured documents confirmed the staggering tonnage. The fuel system was another marvel. The Red Ball consumed 300,000 gallons daily just for its own operations, more than the Wehrmacht allocated to entire panzer armies. And yet, American fuel never ran out. Operation Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, pumped gasoline directly from England into France through undersea pipes. From there, tanker trucks shuttled fuel to forward depots placed every 25 miles. At any given time, an American truck driver was never more than 10 minutes from refueling. German officers who studied aerial photos of these fuel dumps wrote in despair, "The Americans have more gasoline in a single depot than we possess in our entire reserve." What German doctrine considered waste, Americans embraced as redundancy. They assumed 20 to 30% of trucks would break down daily. They assumed engines would burn out, drivers would collapse, and accidents would occur. But because production was so vast, replacements simply rolled in. For every truck abandoned in a ditch, another had already joined the convoy. For every driver lost to exhaustion, another trained man was waiting. The system was not efficient by German standards, but it was unstoppable. And here lies the paradox. German military science emphasized conservation, hiding convoys, protecting vehicles, and repairing every engine. The Americans discarded these principles. They built a supply torrent that did not fear loss, because loss was factored in from the start. This was not the cautious chess of Clausewitz, but the roaring assembly line of Detroit applied to war. The Red Ball Express was not elegant, but it was industrial genius on wheels. What shocked the German staff most was not just the numbers, but the philosophy underlying them. Where the Wehrmacht treated logistics as a delicate watch mechanism, the Americans treated it like a roaring production line. German doctrine was built on conservation, concealment, and hierarchy. American doctrine was built on scale, visibility, and decentralization. This clash of mindsets would decide the fate of campaigns. Consider fuel. Panzer divisions typically carried only enough gasoline for 100 miles of movement. They relied on fragile railway networks vulnerable to Allied bombing, and on horse-drawn wagons that still made up 80% of German transport. Even when trucks were available, they came in a bewildering variety of makes and models: German, French, Czech, Italian, each requiring unique spare parts. A broken Opel Blitz needed one set of tools, a captured Citroën another. For the German mechanic, every repair was a headache. Now contrast that with the American system. Every GMC CCKW was built from standardized parts. A tire pulled from one truck fit another. An engine could be swapped in under an hour with a crane. Transmission failures, which would sideline a German truck for weeks, were solved on the roadside by simply replacing the unit. Where Germans sought to stretch the life of every vehicle, Americans assumed attrition and designed their fleet for rapid replacement. This principle extended to operations. German planners needed weeks to establish new supply routes, issuing timetables through layers of command. The Red Ball Express, by contrast, could improvise overnight. When Patton advanced beyond the original routes, soldiers simply painted new markers and named them White Ball, Green Diamond, or Red Lion. Within 48 hours, these extensions were operational. German officers, trained in meticulous preparation, could not comprehend how such chaos produced functioning systems. Even command structure revealed the gulf. In the Wehrmacht, a sergeant could not reroute a single convoy without authorization. In the Red Ball Express, junior NCOs had authority to redirect trucks, strip vehicles for parts, or change loads on the spot. What the Germans saw as disorder was actually flexibility, born from trust in individual initiative. The result was speed, convoys leaving every 5 minutes, day and night, without pause. The technical outcome was brutal arithmetic. Tires were consumed at the rate of 10,000 per week. Engines burned out after 10,000 miles instead of 30,000. By late September, more than 5,000 trucks had been destroyed or abandoned. Yet American throughput only increased. Replacement vehicles poured in through French ports faster than the Germans could destroy them. In fact, the U.S. Army wrote off more trucks in a week than the entire Wehrmacht possessed in northern France. This reality bred despair. German soldiers at the front could hear the endless growl of truck engines through the night, like a factory conveyor belt that never shut down. Diaries captured their hopelessness. They have endless trucks. We have 3 bullets. The sound itself became psychological warfare, and American propagandists amplified it by broadcasting recorded truck convoys toward German lines. Even when no vehicles were present, the illusion of abundance sapped morale. The broader lesson is clear. German doctrine demanded efficiency, the perfect timetable, the flawless convoy, the repaired engine. American doctrine demanded volume, 12,500 tons a day, no matter how many trucks failed along the way. German logistics was fragile. A single broken bridge could paralyze a corps. American logistics was redundant. If a bridge collapsed, engineers threw up a temporary one in 14 hours, and the trucks kept rolling. It is no exaggeration to say that this philosophy, more than any tank duel or air battle, determined the outcome of the campaign. As Field Marshal Walther Model admitted, the Reich was not defeated primarily by American tanks or planes, but by their trucks. What the Germans had overlooked was that Patton's Blitzkrieg did not rely solely on tactics. It relied on 23,000 drivers delivering the impossible every day. The Red Ball Express was not elegant, and it was certainly not efficient. But it was unstoppable. It proved that, in industrial war, the side with the most trucks will outlast the side with the most brilliant maneuvers. On August 19, 1944, in the dimly lit headquarters of East Prussia, German generals studied the latest intelligence from the collapsing Western Front. They were certain the American advance had reached its limit. From the beaches of Normandy to Patton's spearhead stretched more than 400 miles of broken roads and ruined bridges. An armored division consumed 150,000 gallons of fuel per day, and 12 such divisions were charging eastward without pause. By German logic, the outcome was inevitable. Within days, perhaps hours, Patton's tanks would grind to a halt. Supply lines could not be stretched indefinitely. This was not opinion but arithmetic, proven by bitter experience in Russia, where panzer spearheads had collapsed not under Soviet guns but under the tyranny of distance and empty fuel tanks. Yet beyond their line of sight, something unprecedented was already underway. At ports like Cherbourg, 5,958 trucks roared to life, headlights blazing despite every rule of military concealment. Every 5 minutes, another convoy rolled out, carrying artillery shells, rations, gasoline, and medical supplies eastward. They were part of the newly created Red Ball Express, a one-way highway system designed to keep Patton moving no matter the cost. The system defied every principle of German military doctrine. Rather than dispersing their vehicles to avoid detection, the Americans massed them in endless columns. Rather than conserving scarce machines, they assumed enormous mechanical failure and simply planned for replacements. Rather than operating in blackout conditions, they illuminated the French countryside with the glare of 1,000 headlights, daring the Luftwaffe to strike. German reconnaissance units watched in disbelief, reporting convoys stretching 20 kilometers, vehicles passing every 30 seconds, and traffic that did not pause even at night. To their astonishment, the Americans seemed unconcerned with camouflage or economy. They were applying industrial logic to the battlefield: volume over efficiency, speed over caution, improvisation over rigid planning. Within 3 days, Patton's tanks, which German officers had confidently predicted would be stranded, crossed the Seine and smashed through German defensive positions. Within a week, Paris was liberated. The assumptions of the German General Staff, carefully derived from years of mechanized warfare, had been rendered obsolete by a flood of American trucks. The Red Ball Express was not simply a logistical plan, it was a cultural phenomenon. Nearly 75% of its drivers were African-American soldiers, serving in a still segregated army. Many of these men were denied equal rights at home, yet they became the lifeline of the most celebrated white general's army. They gave their trucks nicknames and painted slogans across the hoods: Patton's Blood Bank, Hitler, Here We Come, Detroit to Berlin Express. They developed their own traffic rules, improvising where manuals failed. Slower vehicles pulled aside without protest, breakdowns were shoved into ditches, and convoys roared past at 35 miles per hour without hesitation. In a matter of days, they had created a living system that was both chaotic and disciplined, reckless and unstoppable. German officers struggled to make sense of what they observed. General Edgar Feuchtinger of the 21st Panzer Division personally watched the convoys from concealed positions. His report captured the disbelief: they operate without pause, vehicles at 30-second intervals, headlights on, no dispersal, no concealment. This is not military science. It is mass production applied to war. For an army still reliant on horse-drawn wagons for 80% of its transport, the spectacle was incomprehensible. The United States was burning more gasoline in its supply convoys than entire German armies received for all purposes. Behind the spectacle lay an astonishing technical system. Mobile maintenance units were stationed every 50 miles, equipped with cranes to swap engines in under an hour. Mechanics operated on triage rules: 15 minutes to fix the truck, or it was pushed aside and cannibalized for parts. Fuel depots were established every 25 miles, ensuring no vehicle waited more than 10 minutes to refuel. Convoys maintained an average speed of 35 miles per hour, day and night, supported by military police who removed any truck dropping below the minimum. It was ruthless, it was wasteful, but it was effective. By the end of August 1944, the Red Ball Express had delivered nearly 90,000 tons of supplies in just 1 week. Patton's divisions advanced at speeds German doctrine considered impossible, 40 to 60 miles per day, double the maximum calculated by German staff officers. On September 1st, the 4th Armored Division advanced 35 miles in the morning, halted briefly for resupply, and advanced another 32 miles that afternoon. A 67-mile advance in 1 day shattered German expectations and defensive planning. Intercepted radio traffic confirmed what German generals refused to believe. The Americans had solved the very problem that had crippled Blitzkrieg in Russia. For the men driving those trucks, the experience was both exhausting and exhilarating. Many operated for 72 hours straight, kept awake by stimulants, the roar of engines, and the knowledge that their cargo was keeping Patton's army alive. Accidents were frequent, and 300 drivers would die during the operation, victims of fatigue, mechanical failure, or enemy fire. Yet morale remained remarkably high. For African American soldiers in particular, each mile driven was proof that they could perform tasks Nazi ideology declared impossible and that their own nation too often denied them the chance to prove. German officers, captured later in the campaign, admitted that the Red Ball Express broke their confidence. As one prisoner remarked, "We knew we had lost when we understood your supply system. You wasted fuel, abandoned vehicles, exhausted your men, yet you succeeded through sheer volume. We could not match it." The endless convoys had become more than a logistical feat, they were psychological warfare. Wehrmacht troops at the front listened to the constant drone of engines and realized that the Americans had an abundance of resources that dwarfed anything the Reich could muster. While German soldiers counted their last cartridges, the Americans delivered millions of rounds with casual regularity. The noise of trucks in the night became the sound of inevitable defeat. By early September 1944, the Red Ball Express had become the artery of the Allied advance. Day and night, convoys poured across northern France, carrying fuel, ammunition, rations, and medical supplies in a torrent that seemed endless. German reconnaissance units reported what their commanders refused to accept: a logistics operation that ignored every rule of military prudence yet functioned with breathtaking efficiency. Continuous vehicle column, headlights visible for 20 kilometers, no spacing, no blackout, one report read. Estimate 1,000 vehicles per hour. The Americans have abandoned all military precaution. To the Wehrmacht, raised on discipline, concealment, and meticulous order, it looked like madness. But this madness was feeding Patton's momentum, and within weeks the consequences would be catastrophic for German defenses. The sheer volume achieved was staggering. In its first week, nearly 90,000 tons of supplies were delivered. By September 5th, the system had settled into a rhythm. Convoys departing every 5 minutes, 60 to 70 trucks per column, each carrying 5 to 7 tons, averaging 14 hours to complete a one-way trip of 350 miles. Round-trip distance often reached 700 miles. At any given moment, 5,000 trucks were in motion. Fueling stations, maintenance crews, and military police kept the flow intact. Even when 1,800 vehicles broke down daily, replacements and roadside repairs ensured the convoys never ceased. The numbers were so extraordinary that German intelligence officers dismissed them as propaganda, until their soldiers on the ground confirmed the convoys with their own eyes. What unsettled the Germans most was the American attitude toward loss. Where the Wehrmacht treated every truck as irreplaceable, the Americans wrote them off casually. A vehicle that failed on the road was stripped of usable parts and shoved into a ditch. Tires were consumed by the tens of thousands each week. Engines burned out after only 10,000 miles of operation, a third of their expected lifespan. By late September, over 5,000 trucks had been abandoned or destroyed. Yet instead of crippling the system, attrition was anticipated and absorbed. American factories produced replacements faster than the Germans could comprehend. In fact, the United States destroyed more trucks in a month than the Reich could field across the entire Western Front. Fuel was the lifeblood of the operation. The Red Ball Express itself consumed 300,000 gallons of gasoline daily, an amount that exceeded the allocations for entire German armies. But thanks to Operation Pluto, pipelines laid under the English Channel, the supply never ran dry. From pumping stations in England, fuel flowed across the seabed into French depots, then into tanker trucks that shadowed the convoys. Forward dumps were established every 25 miles, ensuring no truck ever had to wait more than 10 minutes for refueling. German aerial observers photographed fuel storage sites larger than their entire strategic reserves. To them, it was not warfare but industrial overflow, a display of abundance so overwhelming it was beyond calculation. The contrast in philosophy could not have been sharper. German logistics emphasized concealment. Convoys moved at night, dispersed across back roads, always fearing air attack. American logistics emphasized volume. Convoys ran day and night, headlamps blazing, their visibility irrelevant because Allied air power ruled the skies. German officers demanded strict hierarchy, with orders cascading down the chain of command. Americans delegated responsibility to sergeants and lieutenants, empowering them to reroute convoys, improvise repairs, or seize local resources without waiting for authorization. To German eyes, this was chaos. In practice, it was flexibility, the difference between paralysis and momentum. The results on the battlefield were undeniable. On September 1st, the 4th Armored Division advanced 35 miles in the morning, halted for resupply at noon, then advanced another 32 miles that same afternoon. A 67-mile advance in a single day was more than double the maximum distance German doctrine considered sustainable. Across the front, Patton's divisions averaged 40 to 60 miles per day for weeks, shattering defensive plans that assumed no army could exceed 30 miles of daily movement. German generals at first refused to believe the reports, insisting they were propaganda. But intercepted American radio traffic confirmed the truth. Not only were the Americans advancing at impossible speeds, they were broadcasting their positions openly, confident that they could outrun any German response. The psychological impact was devastating. Wehrmacht soldiers reported hearing the convoys all night, their engines growling like an endless factory on wheels. They faced shortages so severe that some units rationed 3 rounds per rifle, while American artillery units fired without restraint, supported by supply lines that never faltered. At Metz in September, American gunners unleashed 100,000 shells in a single day, more than the Germans could hope to fire in weeks. The Red Ball Express delivered every round plus a 20% surplus. Against such excess, German artillery officers could do little but measure their dwindling stockpiles and recognize the futility of resistance. By mid-September, the strain on the Red Ball Express itself became apparent. Convoy intervals stretched, speed slowed, and German intelligence reported signs of breakdown. But within 72 hours, the Americans reorganized. Transfer points cut runs in half, driver rotations spread the burden, and new vehicles were poured into the system. Instead of collapse, delivery rates increased. Supplementing the trucks, fleets of C-47 transport planes dropped supplies directly to forward units. In a single day, 900 flights delivered 2,700 tons, nearly 10 times what the Luftwaffe had ever managed during its desperate airlift at Stalingrad. Once again, American logistics overwhelmed German precedent. For the Wehrmacht, the realization was grim. They had assumed Patton's advance would culminate when supply lines grew too long. That culminating point never came. Instead, the Red Ball Express created a new form of warfare in which distance was no longer a limitation. German officers admitted privately that they were fighting not an army but an industrial system, one that replaced vehicles faster than they could be destroyed, one that moved supplies with a relentlessness beyond their comprehension. By late September 1944, the Red Ball Express had already delivered over 200,000 tons of supplies, but its pace was beginning to exact a heavy toll on both men and machines. Engines that were designed to last 30,000 miles burned out after only a third of that distance. Tires shredded by the tens of thousands. Drivers, many of them barely out of their teens, were surviving on stimulants, coffee, and sheer determination, often remaining behind the wheel for 72 hours straight. Accidents were inevitable. Trucks overturned on sharp turns, collided in fog, or went up in flames when overheated engines ignited. 300 drivers would ultimately lose their lives to exhaustion and mishap. Yet morale remained high, especially among the African American soldiers who formed 3/4 of the driving force. For them, every mile driven was not only a step toward victory in Europe, but a challenge to the racist ideologies of both Hitler and their own country. German racial theorists had declared black soldiers incapable of technical skill, discipline, or initiative. Yet here were thousands of African American drivers operating the largest mechanized supply system the world had ever seen. They improvised repairs on the roadside, calculated load distributions faster than trained German engineers, and maintained a relentless tempo that stunned even Eisenhower when he visited the operation. Prisoners of war, forced to help load supplies, were bewildered by the efficiency and fairness of these men. Nazi ideology shattered against the reality of black soldiers delivering victory with every convoy. On the battlefield, the results were devastating for the Wehrmacht. At Metz, German artillery units were rationed to 50 rounds per gun per day, while American batteries fired continuously for hours. In one 24-hour period, U.S. forces unleashed 100,000 shells, an expenditure that German calculations deemed impossible. Yet the Red Ball Express delivered every shell, plus reserves. Against such firepower, the fortress city of Metz, long considered impregnable, was reduced in weeks. German defenders understood that they were not only fighting tanks and infantry but a logistics machine that ensured Americans never ran short of ammunition. The system was not without crisis. As Patton advanced ever deeper into France, the supply line stretched beyond 700 miles. Convoy speeds dropped, and breakdowns multiplied. German intelligence officers noted a widening gap between convoys, speculating that the strain would soon bring the Red Ball Express to collapse. But American adaptability again proved decisive. Within 72 hours, commanders reorganized the entire system. Transfer points were established to cut journeys in half. Drivers were rotated more frequently. Forward maintenance bases were created to reduce delays. Instead of faltering, delivery rates actually increased. To reinforce the convoys, American commanders turned to the skies. C-47 transport aircraft began flying critical supplies directly to the front. On September 16, 1944, German observers counted 900 flights in a single day, delivering 2,700 tons of cargo. The Luftwaffe, once the master of the skies, had at its peak managed only 300 tons daily during the Stalingrad airlift. The contrast was crushing. What had been considered the maximum humanly possible by German standards was overwhelmed by American scale. The Germans tried to adapt. During the Battle of the Bulge, they attempted to create their own Red Ball by capturing American trucks and uniforms in Operation Greif. But the effort collapsed almost immediately. German drivers could not maintain American convoy speeds. Their mechanics could not repair the captured vehicles quickly enough. Worst of all, they lacked the fuel to sustain such consumption. 50 captured trucks dwindled to 20 within a week. Where Americans discarded vehicles casually, the Germans struggled desperately to keep each one alive. The attempt revealed the fundamental truth: the United States fought with excess capacity, while Germany fought with scarcity. Even nature could not halt the operation. In the bitter winter of 1944, freezing rain and snow turned French roads into treacherous rivers of ice. German doctrine declared wheeled logistics impossible below -10 degrees Celsius. Yet the Red Ball Express continued. Chains were wrapped around tires, alcohol was poured into radiators, and convoys ground forward at 15 miles per hour. Supplies still arrived. German panzer divisions, immobilized by the same conditions, watched in disbelief as American trucks moved through weather that had paralyzed their armor. The psychological warfare of abundance weighed heavily on German troops. Soldiers on the front lines wrote in their diaries of hearing ghost convoys at night, phantom engines that haunted them even when no trucks were present. The Americans capitalized on this, broadcasting recorded convoy sounds through loudspeakers toward German positions. Troops who already knew they were outgunned now felt surrounded by an endless tide of supplies. Resistance began to feel futile. Captured officers admitted the effect openly. One general told interrogators, "We prepared for your tanks, your planes, your artillery. "We never prepared for your trucks." Another confessed, "You waste more than we produce. How can we fight against that?" Field Marshal Walther Model himself conceded bitterly, "We are not defeated by an army but by a superior civilization." By October 1944, rail lines were being repaired and the Red Ball Express began to scale back. But in its 82 days of operation, it had delivered over 400,000 tons of supplies across 122 million ton-miles. 40,000 tons of ammunition went to Patton alone, along with 15 million rations and 135,000 tons of medical supplies. It had consumed 57 million gallons of fuel, worn out 180,000 tires, and destroyed over 5,000 vehicles. Yet it had shortened the war by an estimated 6 months, saving untold lives and bringing Allied victory closer. The Germans, who had laughed at American logistics in August, were silent by November. They had learned the hardest lesson of modern war. Amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics, but Americans talk trucks. By November 1944, the Red Ball Express had run its course. Railroads, repaired by American engineers at a pace the Germans considered impossible, began to take over the heavy lifting. What was originally intended as a 10-day emergency measure had lasted 82 days, during which nearly 23,000 drivers and almost 6,000 trucks created a rolling river of supply that kept the Allied advance in motion. In those 3 months, the system had delivered over 412,000 tons of supplies, consumed 57 million gallons of fuel, and worn through 180,000 tires. For the German General Staff, reviewing these figures in captivity months later, the numbers were not simply statistics but a revelation of why the Reich had been defeated. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the senior German commander in the West, captured the essence of the failure when he told his staff in mid-September, "The Americans have created a supply system that makes distance irrelevant. Our entire strategy was based on the culminating point of their advance. That point does not exist." In other words, German planning assumed Patton would stall when his fuel ran dry. Instead, Patton's tanks advanced at twice the speed German doctrine considered sustainable, not because of tactical brilliance but because trucks delivered fuel faster than German troops could destroy it. The human cost of the Red Ball Express was heavy but revealing. More than 300 drivers died in accidents, fatigue, or ambushes. Thousands more suffered exhaustion, hallucinations, and injuries. But their determination never faltered. They drove through fog, snow, and enemy fire because they knew their cargo was the difference between advance and retreat. For African-American drivers especially, the operation became a battlefield of its own. Denied combat roles and treated as second-class soldiers in a segregated army, they proved beyond question that they could perform under the most demanding conditions. Their work contradicted both Nazi racial theories and American prejudice. General Eisenhower himself, watching convoys thunder past, admitted, "These men are winning the war as surely as any infantry." Within 3 years, the pressure of such contradictions would help push the U.S. military toward desegregation. For the Germans, the experience was humiliating and terrifying in equal measure. Wehrmacht engineers were astonished to see bridges destroyed by retreating forces rebuilt in hours, not weeks. They observed depots larger than their entire national reserves appearing overnight in French fields. They watched with disbelief as Americans discarded trucks for minor faults while German mechanics labored for days to save a single vehicle. As one captured panzer commander admitted, "We were fighting not your soldiers but your factories." The Red Ball Express also carried enormous psychological weight for occupied populations. French civilians who had endured years of rationing watched American drivers hand out chocolate, cigarettes, and soap as casually as German troops had confiscated them. Convoys became rolling propaganda. Resistance groups swelled in confidence, seeing with their own eyes that Allied victory was inevitable. The abundance on display undermined any lingering belief in German strength. Where the occupiers had offered scarcity, the liberators offered excess. By the time the Red Ball Express was officially shut down in November, its legacy was already secure. Patton had driven to the German border. Paris, Brussels, and Luxembourg were liberated. German divisions were shattered not just by combat, but by the realization that the Americans could outsupply them to death. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, one of Germany's most competent commanders, would later state bluntly, What most surprised me was not your tanks or planes, but your trucks. In cold arithmetic, the operation cost the United States $100 million in 1944. To German officers accustomed to scarcity, the figure was incomprehensible. To American planners, it was a bargain. Each day of war cost the U.S. $250 million. By shortening the conflict in Europe by an estimated 6 months, the Red Ball Express paid for itself many times over. Its impact did not end with the war. Veterans of the operation returned home with unique experience in large-scale trucking and logistics. They founded companies, designed highways, and helped create the modern American freight industry. What they had learned in France, that volume beats efficiency, that speed beats perfection, that trucks rolling 24 hours a day can move the world, became the foundation of post-war commerce. Historians today regard the Red Ball Express as one of the decisive operations of the European theater. Without it, Patton's advance would have stalled, Paris might not have been liberated in August, and the Germans could have established winter defenses along the Rhine. With it, the Allies maintained relentless momentum, pushing the Reich to collapse within 9 months. The German generals who once laughed at American logistics surrendered in May 1945, their armies defeated by a supply chain that defied both physics and precedent. The true monument to the Red Ball Express is not the ruts worn into French highways or the commemorative stamps issued decades later, but the victory it enabled. Every ton delivered shortened the war. Every truck that rolled carried not just supplies but the weight of a new era in warfare, one in which industrial capacity, improvisation, and logistics determined the fate of nations. The lesson remains as clear today as it was in 1944. Tactics may win battles, but logistics wins wars. The Red Ball Express proved it beyond doubt. The roar of 6,000 trucks driving east across France was more decisive than the clash of tanks or the thunder of artillery. It was the sound of a nation's factories turned into a weapon, of democracy on wheels, of an industrial civilization overwhelming its enemy mile by mile. And for the German generals who had mocked American supply, it was the sound of inevitable defeat. The clash between German doctrine and American practice at Aracourt and across the Red Ball Express was not simply a duel of tanks or convoys. It was a confrontation between two philosophies of war. The Germans believed in the precision of engineering, the discipline of doctrine, and the primacy of technical superiority. The Americans, by contrast, treated war as a system, messy, wasteful at times, but resilient and scalable. When examined side by side, the contrast is as stark as the silhouette of a Panther tank against the endless column of Red Ball trucks. Consider the German Panther. It carried the formidable 75mm KWK-42L/70, a weapon that could pierce Allied armor at distances where a Sherman could not reply. On paper, it was unmatched. Yet the Panther was a diva of the battlefield, demanding perfect conditions, steady supply of fuel, well-trained crews, and careful tactical setups. In Lorraine, those conditions evaporated. Mechanical failures immobilized more tanks than American fire did. Mud clogged its suspension, transmissions failed, and once commanders were killed, subordinate officers faltered, bound by rigid hierarchy. The Panther's design philosophy assumed that war could be reduced to equations of range and armor thickness. Reality proved otherwise. Now turn to the Sherman. Its gun was underpowered, its armor thinner, its silhouette taller. But its secret lay in everything around it. Shermans fought as part of combined arms teams, supported by artillery barges calculated with time-on-target precision, by aircraft swooping down with rockets, and by maintenance crews who could swap an engine in hours. In the same way, the GMC trucks of the Red Ball Express were not marvels of engineering by themselves. They were simple, mass-produced, and often driven to destruction. What mattered was the system they belonged to, redundant supply lines, constant improvisation, and the sheer willingness to waste material for the sake of speed. Here lies the critical mistake of German generals. They assumed that the Americans would fight the same war they themselves envisioned. At Aracourt, they expected tank duels at long range. Instead, they found Shermans closing for side shots under a screen of smoke and artillery. During the Red Ball Express, they expected logistical paralysis after a few hundred miles. Instead, they heard the endless rumble of trucks that violated every principle of concealment and efficiency, yet kept armies moving faster than physics seemed to allow. The Germans measured performance by precision and conservation. The Americans measured it by throughput. How many tanks could fire today? How many divisions could advance tomorrow? The comparison between German and American command styles is equally telling. German armored brigades were built around commanders who were expected to lead from the front. When Oberst von Seckendorf and General Major von Braunert were killed in quick succession, their units disintegrated, officers unwilling to take initiative without explicit orders. By contrast, American doctrine cultivated redundancy in leadership. A captain whose radio failed could still rely on platoon leaders to execute independently, and maintenance sergeants carried authority to make battlefield decisions about repairs or improvisations. Decentralization, which Germans dismissed as chaos, became the Americans' greatest strength. Another error stemmed from German assumptions about resources. They believed that fuel shortages and attrition were universal laws. In Russia, their own spearheads had collapsed when supply wagons failed to keep pace. They projected this onto Patton's Third Army, calculating that no mechanized force could advance 400 miles without grinding to a halt. Yet they underestimated the American willingness to devote disproportionate resources to logistics, even at the cost of inefficiency. The Red Ball Express consumed 300,000 gallons of fuel per day just for itself, more than some German armies received in a month. What Germans saw as waste was, for Americans, an acceptable overhead of industrial war. The psychological gap widened with every misjudgment. German soldiers were taught to fear Allied tanks only in direct duels, but instead they were hammered by artillery they could not see, strafed by aircraft they could not stop, and outflanked by Shermans that seemed to appear from nowhere. In logistics, German planners assumed American trucks would obey military rules of camouflage and spacing. When they instead saw convoys with headlights blazing, nose to tail, they mistook it for recklessness rather than confidence. Their failure was not only tactical but conceptual. They could not imagine a war conducted on terms so alien to their doctrine. To illustrate the divergence, one can compare the mathematics of each side. A German armored division might consume 150,000 gallons of fuel daily, but could rarely receive more than half that amount due to bombing and rail disruption. An American armored division needed even more, close to 200,000 gallons, but the Red Ball Express delivered it, rain or shine, with trucks arriving every 5 minutes. In artillery, German batteries rationed shells, 50 per gun per day, while American battalions fired thousands, supplied seamlessly by convoys. In communications, German radios struggled beyond 2 miles, while every Sherman carried multiple channels linking them to artillery and air. The numbers reveal a truth that doctrine concealed. Americans fought with abundance turned into rhythm, while Germans fought with scarcity disguised as precision. What makes these mistakes striking is that German officers were not blind to logistics. They had suffered their own lessons in Russia and North Africa, yet failed to apply them to the Western Front. Instead of adapting, they clung to the belief that superior design and tactical skill could compensate for systemic weakness. When Panthers faced Shermans, they expected engineering to prevail. When German planners calculated fuel consumption, they assumed American trucks would break down like theirs did. Every assumption proved false, because it measured success by German limitations, not by American possibilities. In the end, the Germans' greatest error was cultural. They equated discipline with rigidity, efficiency with scarcity, and quality with complexity. The Americans inverted each equation. Discipline meant initiative, efficiency meant redundancy, and quality meant reliability. Shermans, Hellcats, GMC trucks, none were perfect, but all were good enough, and there were always more coming. Against that tidal wave, German brilliance dissolved into irrelevance. Tanks burned out, trucks ran dry, and officers were left grasping doctrines that no longer matched reality. These comparisons highlight the central irony of 1944. The nation that celebrated engineering perfection lost to the nation that celebrated production scale. The generals who laughed at American logistics and derided Shermans as Ronsons found themselves staring at battlefields littered with their own burned-out Panthers and highways filled with convoys that never stopped. Their mistake was not merely technical, it was philosophical. They fought yesterday's war, while the Americans, with all their noise, waste, and improvisation, were already fighting tomorrow's. The consequences of Aracourt and the Red Ball Express were not confined to the weeks of September and October 1944. Their true weight was felt in the months and decades that followed, reshaping how armies conceived warfare, how nations mobilized resources, and how history remembered victory itself. What at first appeared to be a clash of tanks and convoys became, on reflection, a demonstration of systemic power, an industrial and organizational revolution that Germany could neither match nor even properly comprehend. On the battlefield, the immediate result was brutal clarity. The destruction of the 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades, coupled with the paralysis of German logistics, meant that the Wehrmacht could no longer mount a sustained offensive in the West. Aracourt consumed the last reserve of armored strength available for a counterstroke. The Red Ball Express, meanwhile, ensured that American spearheads did not pause for want of fuel or shells. Together, these events closed the door on any realistic German hope of stabilizing the Western Front before winter. When Patton's divisions pressed on to the German border, they did so because tanks could move and guns could fire every day. The system never faltered. Yet the deeper impact lay in the doctrine these events validated. For decades, military theorists had argued about whether wars were decided by decisive battles or by the weight of logistics. At Aracourt, German gunners discovered that even superior weapons meant little when smothered by artillery and air power, while at the same moment German generals realized that even the most brilliant defensive plans collapsed when the enemy's supply lines functioned with machine-like relentlessness. The lesson was unmistakable. Logistics was not the background of war, it was the war. This realization reverberated in every staff college from Fort Knox to Sandhurst after 1945. In operational terms, the Red Ball Express forced a fundamental rethinking of logistics worldwide. Before 1944, armies saw supply as something to be economized, managed carefully, and shielded. After the convoys rolled, the model changed. Volume became king. If trucks could deliver 10 times the necessary supplies, then battlefield tempo could be sustained indefinitely. Redundancy became doctrine. Expect 30% of vehicles to break down and plan for it. Standardization became gospel. A deuce and a half could be repaired with parts from any other. Improvisation became professional skill. Engineers building bridges overnight, drivers cannibalizing parts on the roadside. German observers who once mocked such chaos were forced to admit, in post-war studies, that this chaos was in fact the secret of American order. For the Americans themselves, Aracourt and the Red Ball Express shaped the future of their military identity. The triumph of Abrams's Shermans, despite their vulnerability, proved that wars were not won by machines but by systems that multiplied their effectiveness. This lesson flowed directly into post-war design. The M1 Abrams tank, decades later, carried his name, embodying the principle that survivability, integration, and logistics mattered more than raw gun size. In logistics, the experience of managing 23,000 trucks and 6,000 miles of road laid the foundations for the interstate highway system back home. Veterans who drove convoys across France returned to America to build civilian trucking companies, embedding military lessons into commerce. The Red Ball Express was not just a military operation, it was the birth of modern supply chain thinking. The human consequences were equally profound. The Red Ball Express had relied overwhelmingly on African American soldiers, men segregated by policy, denied combat roles, and treated as second-class citizens at home. Yet their performance was undeniable. They kept Patton moving. They proved that skill, endurance, and initiative were not bounded by race. Eisenhower himself remarked that these drivers were winning the war as surely as infantry. Their contribution became an early crack in the walls of segregation, adding weight to the calls for integration that culminated in President Truman's desegregation order of 1948. The roads of France thus became unlikely arenas for a civil rights revolution, decades before it blossomed fully in the United States. For Germany, the consequences were devastating to morale and doctrine. Survivors of Aracourt reported bewilderment. Their Panthers had been defeated not by better tanks, but by a system that denied them the conditions under which their tanks excelled. Prisoners described despair at the endless flow of American supplies, the sound of convoys rolling day and night, the spectacle of artillery barges fueled by seemingly infinite ammunition. One officer confessed that the war was lost not because of the front line, but because of the factories and trucks behind it. German military theorists, in captivity and afterward, were forced into bitter introspection. Heinz Guderian, father of Blitzkrieg, admitted that they had invented lightning war but never solved its weakest link, supply. The Americans had solved it, and it drowned the Wehrmacht. The broader Allied coalition also drew strength from these lessons. British commanders, long skeptical of American improvisation, were compelled to acknowledge that the brash, noisy, wasteful methods worked. French civilians, who watched convoys streaming through their villages, experienced American abundance as liberation itself. Soap, chocolate, gasoline, things rationed under occupation, suddenly flowed like rivers. Resistance fighters used the convoys as cover for their operations, confident that the Americans would always come. The psychological impact extended beyond soldiers. It convinced entire populations that victory was inevitable, fueling resistance and undermining German propaganda. Strategically, the consequences extended into the Cold War. Harcourt proved that even technologically superior opponents could be defeated by systemic integration. Red Ball proved that supply networks were weapons as decisive as tanks or planes. NATO doctrines adopted in the 1950s explicitly cited these lessons. In a war against the Soviet Union, victory would not come from dueling tanks but from the ability to sustain tempo, keep divisions supplied, and integrate air, land, and logistics seamlessly. When American planners built bases, depots, and pipelines across Europe during the Cold War, they were echoing the rhythms of the Red Ball Express. There were also sobering costs. Drivers paid with exhaustion, accidents, and lives lost. Tank crews burned inside Shermans, even as their battalions triumphed. Civilians were caught between barrages, their towns destroyed in liberation as surely as in occupation. These costs reminded all who studied the campaigns that victory was not clean. The roads littered with abandoned trucks, the French villages flattened by artillery, the burned-out hulks of panthers, all were part of the price of systemic war. Yet in comparison to the alternative, a prolonged conflict, more dead, a stronger German defense, the cost seemed tragically but undeniably necessary. In hindsight, both Harcourt and the Red Ball Express represented turning points where the nature of modern warfare crystallized. It was no longer about the duel between two tanks on a foggy hillside or the careful rationing of shells by a battery commander. It was about networks, of machines, of men, of ideas. The Germans had perfected the art of the decisive battle. The Americans had mastered the science of the sustained campaign. History would prove which mattered more. From the fields of Lorraine to the highways of Normandy, the verdict was delivered. The side that integrated, supplied, and adapted would outlast the side that engineered, rationed, and adhered. The long shadow of these lessons fell not only across Europe but across the entire 20th century. In Korea, Vietnam, and the Persian Gulf, American forces operated with the conviction that logistics and integration defined victory. In each case, whether successful or not, planners cited Harcourt and the Red Ball as touchstones. The Germans had thought they were fighting Shermans and trucks. In reality, they were fighting an idea, that modern war is industrial, systemic, and relentless. And against that idea, their brilliance proved tragically obsolete. The story of Harcourt and the Red Ball Express is not just a tale of tanks and trucks, it is a parable of modern war. The German generals who had once laughed at American logistics, who placed their faith in the steel hide of panthers or the perfect geometry of ambushes, learned too late that the battlefield had changed. The Americans did not win because their machines were better. They won because their system was stronger, their supply deeper, their doctrine more flexible. The battlefields of Lorraine whispered a simple truth. Perfection in design crumbles when it meets imperfection that never stops moving. A panther could kill a Sherman at a mile, but a Sherman that kept coming with artillery and air above it would eventually find a way. A German staff officer could calculate the exact day Patton's tanks would run dry, but he could not hear the endless roar of 6,000 Red Ball trucks filling the night with fuel and ammunition. Numbers on paper meant nothing against numbers in motion. The lesson that echoes across decades is this: amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. Germany's tragedy was to cling to the myth that a superior weapon or a single stroke of brilliance could redeem systemic weakness. America's triumph was to accept that waste, redundancy, and sheer persistence could win wars faster than elegance ever could. For modern audiences, the takeaway is both sobering and inspiring. War is never clean, never fair, and never kind. But in Aracourt, young tankers proved that training and teamwork could turn underpowered machines into lethal instruments. On the highways of the Red Ball Express, African-American drivers proved that endurance, courage, and determination could keep armies rolling through exhaustion and prejudice alike. Their sacrifices shortened the war, liberated nations, and changed history. And that is why their story deserves to be remembered, not as dusty logistics or obscure tank duels, but as a cinematic testament to how victory is really forged. Not in duels of steel, but in convoys of trucks. Not in isolated heroics, but in systems that keep men and machines moving together. If you followed this journey through smoke-filled hillsides and endless convoys, consider this: history lives when it is told, shared, and questioned. By watching, you've kept these voices alive. If you found value in this story, support the channel by subscribing, liking the video, and sharing it with others who love history. It ensures that more forgotten battles, more overlooked heroes, and more hidden lessons come back to life on this stage. Because in the end, every video here is not just content, it's part of an ongoing convoy of memory, carrying the lessons of the past into the present. And just like the Red Ball Express, that convoy only moves if each of us keeps it rolling.